Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be answering an age-old question, and that is, can you make an effective 2,000-point army using only the contents of combat patrols? So as you guys know, the combat patrol is one of the most affordable ways to get into the game, but after you get the combat patrol, players rarely buy another one or, purchase duplicate units from that said combat patrol. Unless you are just trying to get discounted versions of the models that are inside the Combat Patrol box and then, of course, selling what you don't need. However, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to explore the possibility of using a 2,000-point army just made up of units from the Aeldari Combat Patrol. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the video. So first of all, we're going to be looking at the rules and restrictions of the list. We're going to be looking at the list I gave for a spin this week, with my analysis, of course, and the final thoughts and possible ways to improve the list. So first of all, what are we doing? What are our goals and objectives for this list? So this list must only use models from the Aeldari Combat Patrol. That means Wraithlords, Wind Riders, Farseers on foot, and of course, Guardians of both variants, because the box can build both. You can use any combination of options available in the Combat Patrol, so you're not limited to the options that the official quote-unquote Combat Patrol gives you. Of course, that wouldn't be a lot of fun because the official Combat Patrol loadouts and stuff that are given to you are, not the best options. They're, really meant to be balanced against other Combat Patrols. So let's go ahead and take a look at the list I gave for a spin this week with my analysis. So this is going to be a 2,000-point Combat Patrol list. And of course, we're going to start out with 3 Farseers. They're all armed with the same exact thing, which is the Singing Spear and the Eldritch Storm. And that is because Witchblades do not come in this set, so you can't really convert it or anything like that. So we're going with the Singing Spears. Plus, I like the Singing Spears better anyway on the Farseers myself. So we have 3 of those, no enhancements, of course, as well. For our battleline units, we're going to have a lot of battleline in this list because we have a lot of Guardians in it. We're going to have 3 units of Guardian Defenders. All of them have Brightlands platforms, and these guys are just basically meant to get onto objectives, try to generate some fate dice. We're going to be using a lot of fate dice throughout the battle for multiple things. Because we have more units, we are going to be able to use more fate dice in different phases, so we want to make the most out of that. So Guardian Defenders are, a pretty solid choice for anti-infantry. They do pretty good with their shuriken catapults. Not the best in the index, but, we're limited to what we have. So we do need to deal with infantry. We do need an answer to that. And the Brightlands helps us with anti-large. We do also have 2 units of Storm Guardians. Now, I didn't want to go too heavy on Storm Guardians because there is diminishing returns with their sticky ability. And, if you're fielding too many units, you are losing out on a good bit of damage. Their damage isn't as high and it's a lot more short ranged than regular Guardians, so you are losing out on that. But these guys are pretty durable. Between the invul save and of course the fortune that you can put on them from the Farseers, they happen to be actually quite decent at resisting a lot of anti-infantry fire that you're going to be going up against. So yeah, Storm Guardians, I've talked about them before in previous videos. They are a strong unit. They're best when used in the first turn to secure your home objective, make that sticky, advance onto a mid-board objective by spreading out a little bit in the beginning of the game, just so you can make sure that you can actually reach that mid-board objective with a regular movement and an advance roll. And then, of course, you're going to be using a, fate dice to boost that up a little bit. And then on top of that, they do have decent damage up close. And a lot of people don't realize this, but their Overwatch is pretty good against light infantry. So a unit of 10 light infantry that tries to engage with them will lose pretty badly because of that, flamer Overwatch. You're getting 2d6 attacks and, you're getting a bunch of pistol shots as well as, fusion guns as well. And then, of course, because of the Wraithlords that are also in this list, they are backed up by something pretty durable in the Wraithlord. So, advancing these guys up with a Wraithlord in tow can make actually a very serious speed bump for an opponent who wants to get that objective from you. All right, but what about our damage? Because we can't just rely on Guardians and Storm Guardians to deal damage, right? So those Defenders are going to be able to damage light infantry mostly, and the Storm Guardians can also deal with light to medium infantry with their fusion guns and flamers, but they can't do anything really serious against some heavier targets. However, in comes the Wind Riders. And let me tell you guys, I'm very against in a conventional list running big units of Wind Riders like this. 3 units of 9 Wind Riders is absolutely overkill. But in something like this, where you really don't have any other damage dealers in your army, this was perfect because these guys absolutely mulched heavy infantry that was crossing into the midboard, and even in the opponent's backlines later in the game when these guys survived. And really what I found is that at least one of these units always survived to the end of the game because you don't really have any good fire and fade targets. This is the only fire and fade target that's really effective. So, obviously having something to cast fire and fade on is really important. And these guys can move very fast, can capture objectives and stuff like that. So I did outfit these guys with shuriken cannons, but each unit does have a twin shuriken catapult for that extra secondary power. Again, we are limited to the combat patrol content, so we can't take swooping hawks, we can't take warp spiders or anything like that. So all of our conventional assault kind of secondary scorers that have assault weapons and can move really fast, like swooping hawks, warp spiders, specters, vipers, etc., are missing from this list. So we need something to be able to do that. And Wind Riders are going to be our kind of unconventional and maybe a little slightly inefficient answer to that. However, I really have to say, these guys really put in a lot of work and they did a bunch of damage. Their ability to reroll hits against enemies on objectives was extremely good because if my Storm Guardians ever, kind of got wiped out off an objective in the later game, my Wind Riders were able to come in, sweep them off, and then maybe fire and fade onto the objective, or if my opponent still had some units that were in a good position to kill them, fire and fade back and just leave the objective uncontested for now. Until, of course, I could sweep the rest of his units off the board. And to round off the list, I had, of course, 3 Wraith Lords. All of them were armed with Flamers, Bright Lances, and the Ghost Glaive. Now, I'm not typically a fan of the Bright Lances on the Wraith Lord, but I really did need something in the list to deal with heavier vehicles because I just had so much anti-infantry in the list already and I needed something to round it out. So usually my choice for these guys would be shuriken cannons or missile launchers, but we already have a ton of shuriken cannons in the list, so we really don't need those. And we already have a bunch of anti-infantry with 3 units of Guardians. We have 2 units of Storm Guardians. We have a bunch of Wind Riders. So we really don't need the extra anti-infantry hitting power. So the Bright Lance in this particular list was the obvious choice. And Wraith Lords can act very much like tougher Warwalkers in the fact that they can use Overwatch with their Bright Lance for an auto hit, against opponents that are coming in. So vehicles that are coming in, they can get a cheeky Bright Lance shot against them. In the same way that a Warwalker can, but with less risk because Wraith Lords are much tougher, especially with Fortune. What I loved doing in the first turn of the game is casting Fortune on 2 units of Storm Guardians and Fortune on a Wraith Lord, moving them up the battlefield onto objectives where they could, and then, of course, basically being super tough and hard to kill in the first opening turns of the game. And then, of course, later as the game progressed, the Farseers would then cast Fortune on the Wraith Lords, making them tough and keeping them tough for the remainder of the game. And this was really effective. This made the Wraith Lords much, much tougher than they usually are. So Fortune isn't a power that is considered worth it on Wraith Lords typically. You typically cast it on Wraith Guard, big blobs of those, or the Avatar of Cain, or perhaps even the Yin Karn to make them extremely tough. And yes, those targets are going to be the best targets for Fortune. But when you don't have those, Fortune is pretty good on Wraith Lords, guys, right? Last cannons normally wound them on 3s, but wounding them on 4s makes it a dicey proposition for a lot of armies. And Wraith Lords do come with a 2+ save base, which means when they're in cover, they're saving 50% of the time against most last cannon shots and equivalents, right? You have AP -3, you have a 1+ save in cover, you're going to get a 50% chance of saving, which also means that your fate dice of 4s are going to be more useful than they usually are in your regular games, right? Because most of the time we're either banking on a 5+ invul save when it comes to saves, or we're using them for damage. So the other cool thing about Wraith Lords that a lot of you guys probably overlooked is that they generate fate dice when you kill an enemy unit. And these guys, there's 3 of them. So you're at least going to be killing a unit or 2 a turn in the later stages of the game, turns 3 and 4. So you're generating those fate dice just as fast as you're using them every phase, especially when you have Guardian Defenders. So between the Wraith Lords, backing up the Storm Guardians and Guardian Defenders who are able to, kind of more safely move up the midboard with Wraith Lord support. And then, of course, if your enemy does look and locate a weakness in your list, which, there's not a lot of versatility in this kind of list, so it is weak to a couple of things like really hardcore, hard-hitting close combat can really mess it up, especially Storm Guardians and Guardian Defenders who have no real defense against that. So having the Wraith Lords in there in tow to defend those Guardian squads, hold up enemy units in combat that would threaten them is very important. And also the fact that you do have Wind Riders to clean up afterward. All right, so what are my final thoughts and possible ways to improve the list? So actually, I was really surprised with the results of this list. I thought this was going to be more of a kind of troll/meme thing that wasn't going to perform well on the battlefield, but it was surprisingly flexible despite not having a lot of variety. And again, with this kind of list, you're really not getting any variety at all, right? It's just basically Guardians, Wraith Lords, and Wind Riders. However, those three units are basically the foundation of everything we have in an Eldar index, right? We have our tough units, our Wraith units, we have our fast units with the Wind Riders that are hard hitting, and we have our more objective based units like the Guardians. The damage bases were also covered because we had a variety of weapon options to choose from, but again, it did lack the specialist units to score on secondary objectives, which I found that, the list didn't do well in particularly. So I found actually the tactical objectives were a bit tough at times, especially when you drew the wrong thing. Sometimes you wouldn't have the unit in the position. I'm kind of spoiled with things like swooping hawks and warp spiders, as most of you are, that can just basically move wherever they want to score on those objectives. And when you're running a list that, over half of it isn't fast, so Guardians aren't particularly fast and neither are Wraith Lords, you're really kind of scraping and scrabbling for those secondaries late in the game. So I found that fixed objectives may in fact be better for this list. And yes, that means that you don't get as many command points, but in general, I found that this list didn't need a whole lot of command points to be effective, which was another really kind of neat thing about it. Triple Fortune was insane for the unprepared, even making Guardians feel tough. So a lot of my opponents went into it with misconceptions about how weak Guardians were under the effect of Fortune. When bolters are wounding them on 4s just like they would Marines, players misjudge how much firepower they need to pour into them, and oftentimes that actually allowed the Guardians to survive and end up scoring on primary objectives and even secondary objectives later in the game when I only had like 1 or 2 Guardians left in the unit. The Wraith Lords, backed by the Guardians, did surprisingly well, grappling for midfield objectives, and cheeky Fate Dice Overwatch was a powerful denial tool. And this is something else that not a lot of opponents really saw coming, right? Wraith Lords have double flamers, so if anybody tries to move anything kind of more squishy into the middle of the battlefield because they think maybe the Storm Guardians are a, not so important target, then the Wraith Lord will quickly remind them of their mistake. Also, at the same time, if you do have the command points for it, again, you might not because this list doesn't have an Autarch or anything like that. But heroically intervening with a Wraith Lord is a powerful tool. Yeah, you don't get to strike first, but now that enemy unit is tied into combat with something that is probably going to wipe it out within the next couple of turns. Wind Riders were absolutely brutal anti-infantry and were able to blend a lot of tough units with concentrated firepower. Again, they're basically getting guide when the enemy is on an objective. And they were a very good target for Fire and Fade. I almost considered, actually, because of that, just running them with Shuriken Cannons and not bothering with the Shuriken Catapult, but I didn't want to just do that because if I went against a more experienced player, they would just focus down that Shuriken Catapult unit and reduce my secondary scoring even more. But yes, the Wind Riders were very effective, and I'm kind of thinking that Wind Riders are being overlooked. And I think that they're probably a lot better than people give them credit for just because of the fact that they basically get a built-in guide against enemy units on objectives if they are the closest target that you're shooting at, which is very powerful in the right circumstances. And especially since we're seeing more infantry on the field, more tougher infantry, Shuriken Cannons will most undoubtedly be more important, especially after January. So I think Wind Riders are pretty much deserving of a second look if you're wondering what units are effective tools at dealing with mech targets. Storm Guardians did basically what Storm Guardians do best, which is make objectives sticky and provide screening early on in the game. These guys were really important to my early turn plans. So basically, like I said before, advancing up onto objectives, making them sticky, and putting opponents in a compromising position where they do have to kill the Storm Guardians. And not only that, but they have to actually be on the objective to get rid of it and stop it from being in my control, which can be difficult when you have 3 Wraith Lords, which are fortuned up nicely. The list was also absolutely flooded with Fate Dice, most of which were redundant. And I do want to make this clear right off the bat. The fate dice situation was a little out of control. I don't think we need that many fate dice, really. I was oftentimes having a lot of extra at the end of the game, which, I have to say, wasn't the biggest deal. I would rather have too many fate dice than too few, but I would say, for competitive list building, obviously you probably don't want that many Wraith Lords and that many Guardians just, flooding you with extra fate dice that you may or may not need. However, even though I was pleasantly surprised with the results, it was not a very nuanced list and didn't have a whole lot of tricks up its sleeve. And to kind of give you a sense of what I mean here, the units in this list, at least the vast majority of them, were pretty straightforward. Wraith Lords are beat sticks. They're a pretty straightforward unit. There's not a whole lot of nuance to them. Guardians are pretty much the same way, aside from Storm Guardians. If you know how to use Storm Guardians well, they can very well be a nuanced unit, but the Defenders, not so much. As for the Wind Riders, they were probably the most nuanced unit just because, they can be affected by things like fire and fade, so you can get them to different parts of the battlefield. They have an assault weapon via the Shuriken Catapult, so they can get onto places that your opponent might not expect. And they can pretty much move very fast up the side of the board if you want them to. So, 14 plus D6, it could be 20 if you wanted to with a fate dice. And then another 14 will get you from one side of the board behind terrain to the other side of the board behind terrain. So they can be extremely fast, but the other units in the army cannot. So, fire and fade is not the most efficient thing to use on Guardians and Wraith Lords. I did use it from time to time, just depending on the situation when I really needed to block something off with a Wraith Lord, block off a charge lane or something like that. But it wasn't something that I really planned to do on the outset. And really, it was more of a moment of opportunity rather than something I had planned from the beginning of the game. So, yeah, in general, I don't think the list had a whole lot of nuance. Even the Farseers, it was pretty straightforward, right? Just cast Fortune, make stuff tougher, and, maybe cast an Eldritch Storm at something, shoot an Eldritch Storm, or, boost a Bright Lance to, have better damage or whatever, right? So there wasn't much nuance to it, but I didn't feel that really took away from the fun of the list, which was a good thing, right? Because, overall, a list like this on paper doesn't look very fun. Right? Looks pretty boring. There's not a lot of variety to it. But I have to say, I had a lot of fun playing this list. I played it in 4 or 5 games, and I was pleasantly surprised with the results and the amount of fun I had. I actually thought I was going to be bored of doing this. So I was pleasantly surprised that it ended up being an enjoyable experience for the most part. So in conclusion, the list was actually a lot of fun, and it was a really refreshing back to basics experience. And if you really think about the best ways to learn Eldar, going with the combat patrol really isn't a bad option. It really does teach you the basics in a very, effective and clear way. And while it did lack the nuance and scalpel-like precision of regular Eldar builds, it did have all the tools needed to win games, albeit with less efficiency, especially when it came to secondaries. So yes, this list is a lot less efficient in a lot of ways for scoring secondaries, especially in close games. I did not win every game that I had with this list, by the way, just to let you guys know. As a little disclaimer, it's not the most competitive list out there. It's not the most successful list or powerful list. But, it does compete quite decently against a lot of armies, even competitive lists. So yeah, you won't win the game. You won't score the max amount of secondary points, but you'll kill stuff and it'll be pretty close. It'll be surprisingly close and, probably to the surprise of, your opponent as well. And, I have to say, it did throw a few of my opponents off to the point where they actually missed out on chances to score on primary and secondary objectives because they really didn't know how to handle that many models from an Eldar player. And they went in with the game plan probably on their drive over thinking, okay, I'm going to disable the Swooping Hawks, I'm going to do this and have a plan for this and have a unit for this, right? And then they come across something that has a bunch of Guardians, Wraith Lords, and Wind Riders, and they're like, oh my god. I'm fighting a giant combat patrol. How do I deal with this many Guardians? How do I deal with these 3 Wraith Lords and all these Wind Riders, right? So, the list is a little bit different. It is different than what you would expect of a typical Eldar list. So yeah, that was my experience with the list, and I would highly recommend it to any Eldar players out there who want a really good back to basics experience. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you want to help support the channel and join my Patreon, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a great community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description. And of course, just to reiterate, it's at no cost for you, so we'd love for you to join. I also have a channel store page and am an Amazon affiliate, so if you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon to help support the channel, or you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel at the channel store page to rep your local game store, I will leave those links in the description also. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.